What's up, team? I'm the Theory Creep. This is a Theory Creep, and today we're going to be creeping through some reasonably heavy theory, mostly because we're going to be talking about Mark Fisher, who you may or may not be familiar with, but he was a fantastic cultural theorist, kind of postmodern theorist, a really big author with 0 books, and he killed himself, I think, about 3 years ago. Right at the peak of his career, right when everyone was super interested in what he had to say. And honestly, I have a ton of respect for the guy. Just an amazing writer. So with that caveat out of the way, I guess we can dive into what I actually have to say about Fisher. Really, what Fisher is concerned with is the cancellation of the future. Culture has started moving backwards and started cycling through nostalgia as opposed to advancing into, a progressive future. One of Fisher's biggest books, Ghosts of My Life, is directly about this cancellation of the future, and in it he discusses a term called hauntology, which was developed by Derrida, but was appropriated by Fisher. So Fisher says of hauntology that what is being longed for is not a particular period, but the resumption of the processes of democratization and pluralism. So what Fisher is saying is that the future is no longer dynamic, that the future has now fallen into these repetitive, nostalgic, conservative trends. And Fisher associates this with neoliberalism and the rise of consumerism and corporatism, and I don't think he's wrong. History has stopped advancing. It isn't moving forward anymore. Where I disagree with Fisher is in his moral evaluation of that trend. The fact that history isn't repeating itself anymore isn't that problematic for me, to be honest. It doesn't bother me as much as it seems to bother Fisher. He talks about music a lot. In my world, I focus more on film and media, but the trends that Fisher identifies in music are also present in film and media. Just look at all the rehashes, all the reimaginings, all the reboots that have been going on in the past, 10 years or so. You've got like Ghostbusters, Die Hard, Independence Day, Star Wars. The Marvel movies are nothing but reboots. Spider-Man has been rebooted like 4 times in this decade. It's crazy. So there's a story written by E.M. Forster called The Machine Stops that I think illuminates what's going on in Mark Fisher really well. The story is just uncanny. Like it so accurately predicts the physical details of cyber life. People live in a room, the world comes to them through digital media, everyone's physically isolated but digitally extremely connected. Modern life relies entirely on like mechanical processes that no one really seems to understand. They're all out of sight. No one knows where their food comes from. No one knows where their power comes from. There's this centralization of recreation and professionalism, like work and play, in one discrete device. Now, in Forster's work, this device is like a static room, which, if you're like me, is extremely accurate. I live at my desk. I eat at my desk. I entertain myself at my desk. I play video games. I watch television. But I also work at my desk. I work from home. I send emails. I have conference calls. I do research. And I make these videos. My creative projects are also done from my desk. So for me, the staticness of Forster is pretty striking. But I realize that for most people, that would actually be a point of deviation. I understand that for most people, their online devices are mobile. They carry this connection with them through the world, which for Fisher is actually a way that we digitize ourselves, right? Like in the past, we would sit down at a machine and engage with this like discrete digital world that only exists at that screen. But now the screen is in our pocket, we carry it around with us, and we are always online because we always have these devices with us. But in Forster's story, the people who live in these rooms never leave. So in a way, they are also always online. But again, Forrester wrote this story before there was an internet, so it's pretty crazy. Also in Forrester's story, we see this like incredibly accurate representation of social media. Everyone in the world, in his machine world, is connected to everyone else in a social media YouTube kind of way. Like people give lectures to thousands of anonymous people, but they're not celebrities. They're not like the people who give these performances. The people who present themselves aren't distinct from the anonymous masses. It's like the masses have become this like self-watching, self-aware mass of people.
There were buttons and switches everywhere. Buttons to call for food, for music, for clothing. There was the button that produced literature. And there were of course the buttons by which she communicated with her friends. The room, though it contained nothing, was in touch with all that she cared for in the world.
Even though her room is empty, it contains everything she cares for in the world. Like, that's very poetic and very, very poignant for the world that we live in now. The room that I'm in now is essentially empty. It's only full of connective devices. The devices themselves don't do anything, right? Like the only reason that my computer is interesting is because it lets me connect to these communities, like whether they're audio video communities like YouTube, or textual communities like Reddit, or entertainment communities like a video game, or this camera, for example. Were I a photographer, I imagine this camera would be a pretty amazing piece of technology. I'm not. I bought this camera because it outputs clean HDMI in 4K, and that seems like a good thing to me. So there's nothing in the world that I care about, just like how there's nothing in the world that Vashti cares about. We're alike in that the things that we both care about are manifestations, they're representations, they're not in the world. So reading Fisher, it's hard not to hear a kind of nostalgia, a kind of longing for the world to return to the way that it was. Even though this is exactly what Fisher is critical of in modern culture, it seems like he's unintentionally manifesting the panic that he's describing. Like he's panicking about this repetitive nostalgia in consumer culture, but he's also manifesting that panic in that he's nostalgic for the historical trends of the past. Fisher isn't wishing to return to a particular place. He's wishing to return to a kind of progressive leftist forward movement. There's a privileging here of the new, right? Fisher likes original things. He doesn't like repetitive things. Old and new are placed on top of or underneath each other. This is a rather complex manifestation of nostalgia. Like I said, it's not a straight up wishing for a historical period. It's wishing for a kind of historical trend.
Vashti's next move was to turn off the isolation switch, and all the accumulations of the last 3 minutes burst upon her. The room was filled with the noise of bells and speaking tubes. What was the new food like? Could she recommend it? Has she had any ideas lately? Would she make an engagement to visit the public nurseries at an early date? The clumsy system of public gatherings had been long since abandoned. Neither Vashti nor her audience stirred from their rooms. Seated in her armchair she spoke, while they in their armchairs heard her fairly well, and saw her fairly well.
So it's from this passage that this video series takes its title, Isolation Switch. When Vashti flips the isolation switch, she's immediately connected with a mass community digitally. So when the switch is in the off position, she's isolated, and when it's in the on position, she's connected. Now, what is a switch? It's opposites held in tension. It's the possibility of on or off, the possibility of connected or isolated. Vashti, because she has this switch, is simultaneously isolated and connected, just like modern persons, just like me. I'm in this room talking to you, but you're not here. I'm alone, but we're connected. There's a switching going on between you and I right now. A switching between my isolation, there's no one in this room, and our connection, because hopefully you're still listening to what I'm saying. And I don't think you have to be on YouTube to be in this state of suspension between isolated and connected. I think that any engagement with social media, with text messaging, any of these digital communication mediums that bring us closer together without physically bringing us closer together. We all switch back and forth between connection and loneliness like alternating polarities in an AC circuit. So Fisher's nostalgia isn't looking backwards, it's looking forwards at all the ground we have yet to cover, and it's lamenting the fact that we're not very likely to cover that ground. He's longing for, as he puts it, a lost future. He sees the backward-lookingness of modern media, the way that music and television and film are just rehashing old tropes, as a kind of paralysis. And I think he's right. Modern cinema, especially Hollywood, is so conservative, so afraid of wasting money, that they'll only invest in films that they know will work. And I think profit motive has a lot to do with it. The kind of corporatization of art, the kind of mathematical statistician approach to producing art, really has paralyzed expression in a lot of art forms. Fisher says that what has vanished is a tendency, a virtual trajectory. And that trajectory was towards popular modernism and the new and leftist projects of, workers' rights, women's rights, etc. All really good things. Forster is a lot like Fisher. He's also longing for the new. His story is about a culture that's in a state of paralysis, culturally and physically. Physically, no one is building anything new because they have this giant machine kind of living environment that maintains everyone's lives for them, and this machine is so ancient that anyone who knew how to maintain it or advance its technology is long dead. And everyone who has been born since then is so pampered and comfortable that there's no reason for them to learn how to fix the machine that takes care of them. So physically, Forster's culture is paralyzed as well. Culturally, they're also paralyzed. Though everyone in the world of The Machine Stops is obsessed with ideas and the generation of interesting ideas, no one is coming up with any new ideas. Everyone is looking backwards. Vashti is concerned with history and archaeology and extracting interesting ideas from the past. She gives a lecture on Australian Aboriginal music, which in the story must have been written thousands and thousands of years ago. So she's looking backwards instead of forwards, and so is everyone else in The Machine Stops. In fact, the protagonist, whose name I forget, Vashti's son, is forward-looking. He's trying to advance his life. He's trying to find new things. He looks at the stars. He looks at the world instead of history and the past. And he's excluded for that behavior. Like, he's not normal for wanting to explore and to find new things. Everyone else is looking into the past. Anyway, all this is to say that the world that Fisher is describing as a cultural analyst is shockingly similar to the world that Forster is describing as a science fiction writer. I don't think Forster's dilemma is one of a loss of creativity. I think Forster is misunderstanding what it is to create. So what is new? To Fisher, it's the good, or the real, or the authentic. To Derrida, who invented the term hauntology, the new is a process of destruction. He says, an invention always presupposes some illegality, the breaking of an implicit contract. It inserts a disorder into the peaceful ordering of things. It disregards the proprieties. So invention disrupts the old. It rearranges things, but it doesn't generate something new. Derrida goes on to start using some legal language, and I'll just pull this up for you real quick. Invention can display its originality only in the values of form and composition. As for ideas, they belong to everyone. Universal in their essence, they could not ground a property right. So while ideas drive invention, ideas are not themselves invented. Now, I think it's interesting that Derrida uses the term ideas because it's the same term that Forster uses. Forster's characters are always looking for interesting ideas, and Forster's problem with that is that they're not looking for new ideas. Here, Derrida says that there are no new ideas, that ideas are always regurgitated and they belong to everyone in this kind of pool of notionality. Inventions are composed of ideas that are essentially old, and it's the act of invention that dredges those old ideas into the present reality. The new is contaminated by the old. The new carries the old with it always. So I'm not sure that what Fisher is identifying is in fact unique to the world we live in, or even as problematic as he seems to think it is. And today, perhaps more so than in the past, we're in a cycle of rehearsal. We're rehashing, we're rebooting, we're reimagining. But that doesn't mean we're not moving forward. What Fisher is afraid of is the contaminated future, the future as past. But if the future can be past, then the past can be future. We don't move in a straight line the way Fisher wants us to. History isn't an etch-a-sketch. It's not a linear progression. It's a spirograph. We move in circles, generally with a trajectory that, maybe is forward, maybe is not. But every distinct moment in our history is not necessarily a forward movement. Right now, we're definitely in a backward-looking rehearsal period, but as we'll get into in a few seconds, I think that's for good reason. The linear movement that Fisher is hoping to see, that Fisher saw in the past and wants to see into the future, I'm not sure it ever happened. I think it was always a story or an invention. So Hauntology is the rehearsal of the past, but it's not a direct copy. It's a reimagining. It's something old, kind of reinvented, remixed into something new. So you say a word, any word, for example, let's say hate. And when you say it, you're looking back into your life at every moment of your life that you associate with hate, where you experienced hate or anger or disdain. And you conjure those moments when you say a word like hate. Your word in the present, your present expression, is haunted by your past usages of the word. And you didn't invent this word, obviously, you learned it from someone. So maybe you think about Star Wars and how Emperor Palpatine wanted Luke to embrace his hate and embrace his anger. And maybe that's where you learned about the concept of anger and hatred. So you, even though you're using the word in a way that refers to your own past, you borrowed that word from someone else. And where did George Lucas learn about hate? This is what Derrida means when he says hauntology, and he says that language is haunted by the past. He means that there is no original, there is no singular origin that started language. Language is just this messy miasma of references to the past and slight revisions into modern contexts. So speech is haunted by its own past, but it's also a specter itself. It also has no distinct origins of its own. Words have no linear developmental history. My point is that hauntology, which is a big deal for Fisher, is not a problem to be diagnosed and cured. It's not a symptom that we need to resolve. I think that hauntology may be more of a feature than a bug. So both Fisher and Forster are panicking about a lack of originality, a lack of newness in the modern world. They're panicking about a prevalence of repetition. But as we're seeing, repetition is originality. Or to be more accurate, everything is repetition. There is no originality. Maybe I'm just trapped in the machine, but the world that Forrester is describing is really appealing to me. And like I said, it doesn't seem that different from the world we live in now. A world of people free to communicate and interpret and express themselves without the need to work or sustain themselves. It sounds a bit like a paradise. They're free to read and generate new interpretations and explore the past. And this is the crux of the problem. Fisher and Forster don't see interpretation as relevant, as authentic, as meaningful. Fundamentally, they don't see interpretation as creative. But I think that all creativity is interpretive, so all interpretation must be creative.
At midday she took a second glance at the earth. The airship was crossing another range of mountains, but she could see little, owing to clouds. Masses of black rock hovered below her, and merged indistinctly into gray. Their shapes were fantastic, one of them resembled a prostrate man. "No ideas here," murmured Vashti, and hid the Caucasus behind a metal blind. In the evening she looked again. They were crossing a golden sea, in which lay many small islands and one peninsula. She repeated, "No ideas here," and hid Greece behind a metal blind.
So I think unintentionally Forster is describing himself with this passage. Vashti is confronted with this amazing, dynamic, interesting world as she looks out the window of this airship, and then she murmurs to herself, "No ideas here." This is what Forster is doing. He's creating a fascinating world with a intricate and nuanced culture, and he's just dismissing it as not interesting, not creative, without really evaluating it. So it's worth asking about Forster's story, when did the machine stop? From Forster's perspective, right? Like, the story has a discrete moment where the machine stops working, but the story isn't called "The Machine Stops Working." What's the machine in the title of this story? Is the machine in the story? The so-called machine that sustains human life? Could be, but it could also be that the machine Forster is referring to is the machine of human culture. And maybe the machine stopped long before the story began. Maybe the machine stopped when human culture stopped moving forward. Again, from Forster's perspective, people aren't innovating in this culture. They're not meeting each other, they're not connecting, they're not really being together. In fact, the son of Vashti really wants to come and see her. He wants to be with her. And this is weird in Forster's culture. No one really wants to be with anyone. They want to talk to each other and connect with each other cerebrally and digitally, but physical interaction has long since become obsolete. People aren't breeding, right? Like, they're not having sex, they're not having babies, and they haven't been for a very long time. They have to be made to do this. And that's been the case for as long as the machine has been operating, the machine that sustains humanity. But I think it's worth considering that the machine in Forster's title is actually the machine of human creativity, the progressive project of leftist advancement. And that stopped a long time ago in Forster's narrative. Did the machine ever stop? Or did it just change directions and start moving backwards? Just tracing the edges of its history with careful footsteps? Is Forster just another scared old man, another conservative who's unable to see this backward movement as forward progression? So fear's a funny thing, right? Like, it's hard to identify exactly what it is that scares us. Fisher says that he's afraid of the growing cultural tendency to repeat. But is that actually what he's afraid of, or is it something else? I think, to some extent, Fisher is afraid of political defeat. Conservatives want to return to a past, That's the whole thing about conservatism. You want things to stay the same. And it's this return that Fisher is so afraid of. The truth is we can't know what Fisher was afraid of, and that's the tragedy of this video and any other video about Mark Fisher. But I can tell you what I'm afraid of, and I think it directly refers to this conversation. I'm afraid of the future, and I don't think I'm alone in this. Environmentally, politically, in particular environmentally, we don't have a future. There's nothing ahead of us. Like the global, what was it called? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2019 said that we have 20 years to reverse climate change, and if we don't stop the increase in carbon emissions and stop the net increase in heat, after 20 years, there will be no going back. So that's a problem, right? Like, we're not going to resolve carbon emissions in 20 years. We've had more than 20 years to deal with it. And anyway, I don't think we have much of a chance as a species, or at least as a culture. As a species, we may persist, but I won't be making YouTube videos in 30 years, I'll tell you that much. So with this bleak future ahead of us, doesn't it make sense that we'd start looking backwards? That we'd start looking at the past instead of the future? Because there is no future. The only direction we have to look at that isn't terrifying and bleak and just depressing is what's already happened. So for me, it seems completely natural to be rebooting and rehashing things from the past when we have no future to look forward to.